Hello everyone, this is Maz. If you're hearing this message, it means you're not part of the Voices of War subscriber community and will only hear the first half of the episode. If that's enough, then I'm thrilled. However, if you're looking to dive deeper into the complexities of war, please consider subscribing to our private feed by using the link at the top of the show notes. By doing so, you'll gain access to all of our episodes, the ability to ask follow-up questions, and will become part of an exclusive community that makes this show possible. I hope you'll make the decision to join us today.
We are no longer in charge. The major actor is the hyperobject, and it will exceed anything we think we can project, manage or map or anything like that. The threat environment is entangled, which means that planetary, human and state security are now inherently interconnected. It's just simply incompatible to have World War III or massive escalation of warfare and address the hyperthreat. Because the more warfare you do, the more you strengthen the hyperthreat. Voice and ideas are so controlled that we're actually stifling our biggest asset, which is that creative problem-solving ability that people have. What is going on at the moment is a fight for what's left and for dominance, but that fight will derail the chance to save our ecology.
My guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Boulton, who is an eco-military theorist with Destination Safe Earth and a research affiliate with the Climate Change and Insecurity Project, which is a collaboration between the University of Oxford, the Centre for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research, and the British Army. Her doctoral research developed the idea that climate and environmental change constitute a new form of threat, a hyperthreat. She then applied modified military threat analysis and strategic planning tools to investigate options for a hyper response. This led to Plan E, the world's first climate and eco-centered security strategy, published by the US Marine Corps University Press in 2022. Previously, Elizabeth served as an officer in the Australian Army, where she deployed to East Timor and Iraq. Later, as a civilian, she spent time in Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan in humanitarian work. In 2007, she completed a Masters of Climate Policy at the University of Melbourne before moving to the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, working in its National Climate Centre in climate risk communication. She joined me today to discuss her thinking behind the concepts of hyperthreat, hyper-response, and Plan E. Elizabeth, or I think you prefer Liz, thank you for joining me on The Voices of War.
Thanks very much for having me.
So before we get to Plan E and all the thinking that's gone into it, I think it's useful to get to know you a little more. So as mentioned in your bio, you were in the Army. Why did you join in the first place, and what was your career like?
It's funny, I joined straight out of school to ADFA, and I actually was in the Navy initially. And while I was...
No, we have to stop the interview.
Yeah, and while I was there... I transferred to the Army, and that was the typical reaction from people. I remember one girl ran up across the quadrangle sort of thing screaming at me, what are you doing? You know, do you like your back? Do you like your knees? And
that's understandable. Yeah.
People thought I was crazy, but it did. I had no idea about the Army. Actually, in year 12, there was the Hoddle Street massacre, and I remember that the shooter was he'd been kicked out of Duntroon, and I actually said at school at one stage, joining the Army is the last thing I would ever do.
Wow.
So it is quite funny. But basically, look, I was someone who loved rock climbing and being outdoors and all of that. And then once I got to ADFA, I saw the team culture, and I'd come back from a tour with the Navy where we'd sort of been in nice hotels and shown a lot of machinery and stuff, and then I saw the Army people come back covered in mud and very the camaraderie and stuff, and I actually thought that's what I prefer. But and the opportunities, I wasn't really technically minded, and the Army had more options for someone like me who wasn't technically minded. I went into transport and logistics.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that's hey, I went through ADFA as well, and I distinctly remember seeing our Navy and Air Force friends coming from their exercises, and of course us in the green. So distinctly embeds an us and them very early on in the career. And what did they say? Army navigates by the stars, Navy sails by the stars, and the Air Force sleeps in 5 stars. I think it's something along those lines.
Yeah.
Or at least that was the joke. Okay, and how did you then end up doing a PhD on climate crisis? Because that's a pretty significant shift from joining the army to then being a PhD researcher on climate crisis.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, the day after I got back from Iraq, I was walking down a Fitzroy Street in St Kilda. There used to be a lovely bookstore there, and I came across a book just browsing through which alerted me to climate and all range of environmental problems. And I was just absolutely spellbound because I couldn't, at that stage, it had come out about the weapons of mass destruction, not existing, etc. And I couldn't understand why I'd seen the enormous mobilisation for the Middle East or for Iraq weapons of mass destruction, but here was this other thing that was going to potentially, kill stacks of people, and it seemed nothing was being done. And that was in 2004. So that book actually prompted me to get out and start a new career. And that, that's when I started, I did the Masters of Climate at Melbourne Uni and started working in that field, and then ended up at the Bureau. But while I was at the Bureau of Meteorology, which was an incredible privilege actually, because I was working with really some of the top climate scientists, and their intellects were in their absolute stratosphere, and it was really quite incredible. But I was watching the very siloed way of analysing all the different environmental things, and I could see immediately that there was no intelligence function of joining the dots at all. And so when I went into that environment, I could bring my military background, and I saw it as a threat, as a sort of early warning centre. But there was sort of a missing layers of interpreting those signals, and also problems with communicating those signals out to people. But it was a very interesting time because even at that stage, which was quite a long time ago, there were various climate scientists getting all sorts of personal attacks, being censored, some being sacked for speaking out, and also suffering Great Depression, that like they're watching the death knells of the planet the whole time and not being listened to. So anyway, but what I from being in that environment, I think I was inspired by their intellects, and there was a real sense of being on this sort of front line of an important issue, and I saw these interlinkages between military methods and so forth and threat, and that's why I then decided to do the PhD.
Is that then when the idea of the Hyperthreat was born, based on what you saw at the Bureau, and then applying your, I guess, military hat to provide a kind of first level analysis of what you're actually seeing in the real world?
I think, as you mentioned, I had some time in Africa, and I was in Sudan where there was that incredible starvation, and I was working around a lot of those camps where you had just severely malnourished people and moderately, but the severely, it's just, they're like skeletons with glad wrap on them. It's pretty crazy, just awful to see. But I think as soon as I read that book, in my mind, I saw this as a threat, because I'd experienced that starvation and that sort of thing. So I saw it as a threat immediately in my head at that stage. But the development, the PhD, the start point concept was, for me, was why aren't we responding to this how we would to some other big, crises, like even the global financial crisis or all sorts of things that we obviously know how to do it, but why aren't we doing it? So that seemed to me the bigger question, because a lot of people could sort of nut out, well, yeah, you should just do a Marshall Plan, but we're not doing a Marshall Plan, so why aren't we? And so I then had quite a bit of time researching climate communication, and at that very stage there was also a lot of people researching this because of the failures of Copenhagen and stuff. Why weren't people responding to these climate facts? So there was a massive body of research on it, and at the same time neuroscience was making all these breakthroughs about how cognition happens and so forth. So from that, I determined that the centre of gravity, the main thing holding people back, was their deep frames, which that refers to these really deeply entrenched neuron pathways that are pretty much formed from birth, from constant what we now understand with the brain is that we form these first through sensory signals. We have 5 senses. They sort of act as detectors of signals from the environment, and then they sort of cross-reference each other, and the more they cross-reference, the more it solidifies a neuron pathway as evidence, and that's how cognition... So this is the precognitive thing that builds the software. So there was a lot of research on deep framing, and basically what it occurred to me is that we don't actually have, and this is not just my ideas, but a whole stack of brain scientists, we don't have a neuron pathway to conceptualize this problem. So we don't even have this, we're thinking in Excel, but the problem's in Word or something. You know what I mean? We actually had to build a new way of thinking and conceptualizing. And so basically I saw that as the center of gravity, and I diverted almost my entire focus, and I started this actually, and I stopped and started a bit, but in 2012. So my center of gravity analysis hasn't been like an hour or two on a whiteboard. It's been sort of years of deep inquiry into it.
And I guess is it you're obviously focusing a lot on the human psychology, and how that's translates into, and I guess if you're talking about framing, into the narratives that we accept as true, and then of course because of your background in crisis communication, I'd imagine how we then communicate that. Is that broadly
right? Yeah, that's right. And basically but it's actually even bigger than that. It's a whole world view. And so it's this idea that we're called moderns, which is we can't even understand. We're a unique form of human when you look across the spectrum of humans, that we don't really get it, that we're dependent on the natural world. So moderns are very disconnected.
Well, we're so disconnected from the natural world, right? Especially in our urban environments. Yeah,
like we're industrial creatures. We think in a particular way, and that way of thinking is now redundant for our survival. So basically, I was on the hunt then for a new way of thinking, and I was hunting. Like I really had a military mindset with it. Like I must solve this problem, and so I was looking for thinkers who were at the forefront of thinking in a new way. And that's when I came across Timothy Morton's book, Hyperobjects. And there's a few others that have influenced me, but he was obviously critical. And what really struck me was I was instantly intrigued by his book, but what also I got incredibly irritated when I was reading it. Like every page I was sort of like cursing and I had to have Wikipedia open at the whole time to interpret it. But what I realised is that they say that when you get a concept or an idea that challenges your neuron pathway, you don't actually have any structures for it, that humans have a response called flooding out, or they have a severe reaction. And I realised that I was flooding out because he was telling me something new, and the fact that I had such a reaction made me realise he was that there was something in this. And the more I read it, the more I thought this is it totally responds to the deep framing research. And,
that's really interesting.
I probably should explain his concept a little bit more, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. Just before, and I definitely want to get into that, but I just want to circle back on the deep frames, because I think that's a really important point that might not be as obvious. But I mean, these are concepts that we take to be, it's almost like axioms. They're self-evident truths that we don't question anymore. And what you just described now when you were reading, I guess Morton's book is what I've experienced reading work on free will or non-duality in the meditation space, which are kind of things that they strike you as so bizarre and foreign that your brain just can't compute it. You almost, and like you said, you kind of had to walk away and come back, but there's something that keeps pulling you back that intrigued you to try and unpack it, and I guess in a way makes you look at everything all the previous frames that you've kind of built multitudes of layers, like layers of onion on. It makes you unpick all of those to then completely change potentially how you look at the world around you, or how you see yourself as part of that world. And that's what I've just heard you describe when you were reading Morton's book. So it really resonates with me, because I think and that only takes, in my experience at least, that only happens when you delve a lot of time into one particular question, rather than on Twitter or on social media or reading, on a newspaper or something that's kind of very kind of today and now, as opposed to something that takes quite some time to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we've had this conception in the Western world probably that we're at the peak of intellect and understanding things and all that sort of thing, but and even that human evolution is finished. But basically, there's an understanding now that it's not finished, and that actually, like, one of the ways that we have thought is that the humans are the dominant species, and that our way of way of philosophy and understanding and meaning making is the only way. And so there's actually this whole field of study called new materialism that looks at objects and nature and says, well, they're alive at a molecular level, and all sorts of things are going on there. And when we go into these atoms and things and understand how particularly at the quantum level, how behaviour happens, they say, well, who said that humans are the masters of knowledge? That in fact, what if we go back to the atom and back to these quantum principles and understand how nature actually works, and then derive philosophical principles from that? So basically, there's a lot of work going on in this area, which is really quite fascinating. But it decenters the human as the locus of meaning. And particularly with the Morton's concept with a hyperobject, is what he argues is that, just to give a very simple, instead of climate change being described, or he prefers the term global warming, as endless series of statistics, ice melt, soil degradation, yada yada,
and graphs and so on,
and graphs. He materializes it; it turns it into one thing, and he says it's a new object. Just means thing in philosophical language, but it's a new thing that humans have never encountered before. So his entire book it's got 5 characteristics, and each chapter describes an aspect of its characteristics. But it moves in a way that a thing that we've never. We have to learn what it is basically before we can. And we don't even have any consciousness very limited consciousness of it. But it moves sort of like fog. It's diffused through everything.
And sorry, this is about climate change. When he's describing climate change as having these 5 key. That he explains as hyperobject. Yeah. So it moves like fog. It's distributed over vast time frames beyond the human's conception of time frames, or a human life type of era. Planetary scale time frames. It operates through other objects. So say, for example, we have a drought. We see the cracked soil, but we don't see. You can really point at global warming and say, there it is, but you see its impacts, the wind rustles we know the wind's there because the leaves move. Yeah, that's right. You see the result, but not necessarily the cause or where it's originated from. Yeah.
So he has basically a whole series of these things, but what he's emphasising is that this is something that it's beyond our cognitive abilities. And it defies the way we understand knowledge and things like that. And we can't even model it. And even that we're, those Russian dolls that they're packed inside them.
My daughter's playing with some at the moment.
Yeah. So he's saying we're like the little doll in the middle. We can't even get out of the problem to properly see the problem. And so it's really about humbling the human and basically saying that this century, we are no longer in charge. The major actor is the hyperobject, and it will exceed anything we think we can project, manage, or map, or anything like that. We've got to be humbled that this is a gigantic thing that we don't fully understand. We've got, obviously a lot of science, but it will still defy our understandings. So this is actually quite an important thing, because from a risk planning, just to put this into practice, it's actually used. This concept is used in risk and disaster planning, because it sort of becomes a thing to say that, remember, it will defy our understanding of how it will behave. The fire will be stronger. It will exceed. And even in monitoring certain things, people said, well, it blew. They've got certain measurement. Like a scale of 1 to 10 of how much humidity or something happens when a cyclone happens or something, but it's blowing those charts.
Right.
So it's basically what that says to me is that if as a threat planner, if you know that we're not going to be able to fully understand it, then you have to put in stacks more mitigation and buffers and protections, because it changes your mindset of how you approach the threat.
Yeah. Well, I guess you have to account for a lot more. Well, as we'd like to say, fudge factor, right? I mean, it's you might be thinking even on a household budget. When you say, okay, well, this is what I expect to spend, but let's put a fudge factor in of 10-20%. And I think to now put that into a hyper object, which, as you say, is so grand and spans such vast temporal horizons that we just can't imagine it at an individual level, probably at a societal level. I think the fudge factor should be, probably a lot more significant.
And that capacity for us for not to see it. So one of the main things he says that we can't really, it's defying our conception, is that is exasperated by, the media control and all sorts of the battle for the narrative and
incentives.
Yeah. So I mean, even just yesterday, I heard that there's like extreme fires going all through Chile, but I had to sort of Google certain things, just do a search on climate emergency or hashtag, and they're not coming up in our media naturally, and you're only stumbling across these pretty amazing things sometimes by having to, random. I'm not researching it constantly every day, but what's, if you think from a threat perspective, you would have proper analytics and you'd have a screen with all those things happening live with great graphics and all the rest of it, but we don't have that.
A control center of sorts or operation center, as we've come to know them in the military, to track all the significant activities in a particular area, which is it's incredible that we don't. But again, I think the reason we don't is because it's such a grand problem that what matters for us in Australia today and what's happening in Chile today. It's the 24-hour news cycle doesn't necessarily care about Chile because, hey, we've got another election, we've got a meeting here or a conference there or a multitude of other issues to consider, whether it's foreign policy related or domestic policy related. There's only so much time in a day, and of course, the things that are going to capture eyeballs are the ones that take precedent. So that's, I guess, the hyper object and the idea of the hyper threat. In your writing, you talk also a lot about the concept of entangled security. So how does that fit in then into this kind of overarching hyper threat / hyper object concept?
Could I just backtrack just one little quick thing on the hyper threat to distinguish it from, it's not identical to Morton's concept because he has a sort of idea that the human is powerless and we're just going to be like a leaf blown around on the pavement and we have no agency. Which
is quite defeatist, yeah.
And also objects, sort of like just neutral term, like it's just a thing, it's not really dangerous or anything. But the threat, the hyper threat concept, I'm basically drawing upon saying, well, actually, we've humans, we're not done and dusted. We have got thousands of years of knowledge of how to respond to overwhelming, dangerous threat, which we can apply and bring to the table. That we have, I still believe we still have some agency, but not as much. And the other thing is that the threat term, I'm actually really trying to spotlight that actually this is presenting a new form of violence, killing, harm and destruction. And also that it's not just a hazard, they used to use the term hazard for natural disasters, which were just distinguished from a threat in that there's no hostile intent, there's no consciousness of doing harm. So it's like a train driver accidentally had a heart attack and derailed the train. That's caused, or there was a naturally occurring cyclone. But the threat thing is fairly deliberate because actually there are new forms of conscious intent to cause harm, and we see that with particularly the fossil fuel industry actions over decades, really, that they know what they're doing, and it's a different form of hostility because it has that slow violence, hyper object type. It's not like walking up and shooting someone in the head, but it's still going to kill millions. But because we don't conceptualize it as a threat, it's the threat itself is masked and the hostile actions are masked. Yeah. So it's almost like we have to. The hyperthreat definition is we have to completely reconsider the nature of violence and who are the violent actors. Of course, and when you think about it, that it is through those actions that are contributing to the hyperthreat. Things that we're not going to link BP to a drought in Somalia, and therefore a mass exodus of climate refugees who are going to try to get into Europe, who are therefore going to increase tensions and the further populism in Europe that is going to fracture Europe even more, that's going to then cause
antagonism between European nations that might ultimately lead to a conflict between those two nations. So I think this is the kind of flow of, the upstream causes are happening now and have been happening for decades. And the results are, we're slowly seeing the results, but we're not necessarily making the cognitive leap that, hey, there is a causal chain here. This has started because of our human activity on this earth, and without blaming individual companies or individual humans who are part of the incentive structures and incentive models that have allowed such a system, such a model, such a business model, such a consumption-based perpetual growth model. It's not about that. It's not about, I guess, demonizing them, but it's recognizing that they are inadvertently part of or increasing the threat to all of us. And of course, the flow on from that is going to be this kind of expansion of violence and death and destruction that's going to affect all of us. Is that a broad summary?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's one of Morton's key things, is that the cause and effect thing is completely disrupted because of these vast scales and so forth. But and also about not demonizing. I think a fairly significant thing in this new approach to threat is that you don't focus on identities at all, because there's a whole stack of research on genocide studies, hate studies of what happens when you assign an identity as a threat identity. But I'm basically saying you've got to be extremely careful about that, and in fact only focus on behaviours and actions. And I think so and then because the threat is diffused and got all those different variants, we still can't ignore it. We just have to develop new threat response mechanisms that match the nature of this new threat. And it is actually part of I do think it is part of the design that they don't want this in the security sector, because if we turn the lens and go onto that, it disrupts the whole way we perceive security, which is, we have this legacy of the last century. Really, we started using security forces to support that resource extraction. And in fact, this is why this is quite revolutionary, because actually it turns out we're using our security forces to support our new enemy, and exacerbate something that's going to kill us. So really, this new lens opens up a lot of things, really. And the other thing is that whole thing of how the threat appears. It appears in a very nice suit. It's very wealthy. It's gone to Yale. It's it's very well mannered, and that is not how we perceive a threat. But their threat actions, we've got to not obscure how dangerous they are because of the way it's packaged and presented as I've just been listening to Elvis lately, and that song, You're the Devil in Disguise was running through my head, talks like an angel, walks like an angel. But so there's a bit of that element going on.
That's so true. And it's a really interesting way to look at it, especially this kind of, what you just said about the idea of using, military power to ultimately secure what is going to be what's already turned out to be our enemy or the threat. And that's because to protect our trade routes, right? It's in our national interest to protect our trade routes, to sustain our way of life, improve our way of life. And of course, the mission of in our case, the Australian Defence Force is to protect Australia and its interests, whatever those interests might be. If that is to secure our trade routes, so that our economy stays alive, which of course, in Australia's case, is hugely based on the export of natural resources, then of course we're using ultimately, our nation's defence force to undermine human security more broadly, which is again a really interesting way to. And this is, I'm in uniform. This is not about demonizing. This is just about, again, like you said, reframing the narrative to realize what is actually happening and why there's so little action. And does this then bring us to the idea of the concept of entangled security?
Yeah. So with this whole thing of trying to find a new way of framing everything, so the first chunk of intellectual work was to develop the hyperthreat concept. And then the second, and again, this is following just basic sort of Clausewitzian approaches, was one, understand the threat in great detail, the nature of it. So the second one was then to understand the threat environment. And so I'm saying that the threat environment is entangled, which means that planetary, human and state security are now inherently interconnected. And so that provides a different lens on the security environment. And just to give that's at its most basic level, but there's a whole stack of theoretical concepts behind it. But just to give a tangible example is, if you had an entangled security lens, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, the first thing is, one of the first, the resource and other aspects of it aren't spoken about that much. But firstly, it's one of the most important food bowls of the world. So, when you're weighing up military action and choices, the impacts of destroying one of the most crucial, apparently the thick, good soil there goes down 3 meters or something, like this dark loam soil. It's incredible. An entangled thing would understand those follow-on impacts to people in Africa, etc. And
as
and
we
also,
saw very early on, right?
Yeah, and just even when you constantly people talk about protecting trade routes or conflict in the South China Sea, or even that what they're completely missing from that is that the ocean is on life support. We've got all these fisheries struggling to survive. So if we're going to lay a whole lot of sea mines and torpedoes and things and all sorts of submarines and sonars and stuff underwater battlefield, we wipe out fisheries which support. That's one of the most important food sources for the whole Asia, the Asian region, and especially the Pacific with the tuna. It underpins their entire economies. So military planning now, without thinking about these on a very, very fragile ecosystem, without thinking of these things, it will undermine all of our security. So it's basically that now we have to think of all those things when you're thinking about security at the same time. And of course, there's the follow-on human impacts because once you're losing food and livelihood, you know what happens next.
Yeah, of course, that's right. Yeah, and again, this is part of the flow-on effects to conflict, further destruction. The less resources there are, the greater the competition over them, and of course, the greater the tensions leading to then conflict. One of the things that I think is really important to unpack, and that is that unfortunately, the actual belief in climate change, that it's human-caused climate change, has been politicized. I think it's accepted broadly across the halls of power globally that it's real and that it's human caused, and that the clock is ticking and that we're already way behind where we should be if we are to reverse the impacts. But of course, there are many prominent public figures who are discrediting the science, claiming that it's overblown or that it's alarmist. How do we overcome this? I mean, because it strikes me that this is the first big hurdle before we can start even thinking about a resolution or addressing the hyperthreat as you intend, is about bridging this gap of, climate science denial or suppression.
I think it factors into why I'm saying the centre of gravity is the deep framing or a capacity to see the problem, because it's not the fog of war, it's the fog of conception. And in fact, there is a massive information warfare going on and has gone on for a very long time. There was a book called Merchants of Doubt released, I think, maybe 15 years ago or 10 years ago, which went into great detail of all the methods, basically moneyed interests of the fossil fuel sector were using, setting up these fake think tanks, funding stacks and attacks on climate scientists' credibility, and also all sorts of dagger and cloak sort of background behaviour to discredit the science, and anyway, and they've become quite masterful at it. I think it is a real problem, and so that's one of the things in this Plan E. I have a thing called Operation Visibility and Knowability, which is to and I'm not saying this is easy, but we actually, as a survival mechanism, we have to regain the sense-making mechanisms in our society. For example, we know, I think most people are pretty aware that the media is owned by moneyed interests again, but
we all still listen to it. We all still watch it. I mean, this is the cognitive dissonance that we all know it's biased, but we all still watch it, which I just don't understand.
But it's gone into overdrive, and even now, I don't know if you've heard of this book. It's called Choke Point Capitalism, and basically what that goes through is one after one of every form of creative expression of the human being, whether it's musicians, singers, songwriters, writers, authors, how that gets funneled by that same elite corporate structure. So to get your music played on Spotify, there's all these hoops and things that it's all set up. So what essentially that means is that all the and even most of our creative industries are funded by fossil fuel. So human expression across the entire world is basically completely choked and controlled by moneyed interests. So the hope that gives me is that there are actually quite a lot of people are already aware of this, and we're seeing all these, this rise of all these independent podcasts and YouTube sites, and a whole stack of people have just gone off mainstream media.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I think, and for example, like Russell Brand, he's actually taking a role where he's really committed to listening to both sides, because there's a perception that climate change is a hoax. He sort of engages with so-called right-wing concepts and left-wing, and he's trying to understand that these ideas of divide and conquer are actually working against us. But one of the things is that we have to recapture, or not recapture, it's sort of, I guess, a pretty militaristic term, but we have to acknowledge that the hyperthreat enablers have taken our sense-making and communication systems. And so part of the strategy is reclaiming those. And I have a concept called the 60,000 artists, and it's not just people who paint, it's like your best filmmakers, your best YouTube, TikTok creatives, people who are incredibly good at communicating. The other thing I think is quite important is to unpack for people how this science is distorted. And just to give you one example, when I worked at the Bureau, something that's always stayed in my mind is we had a conference on climate change miscommunication, and the director of the Bureau at that time, whose name was Greg Ayres, who was an atmospheric physicist, he brought in a pile of these sort of skeptics books, about 9 of them, and he had read the whole lot of them, and he was shaking with horror. And he went through one example. He just pulled out one paragraph of, some supposed stat, and then demonstrated how they'd manipulated the stats and how they manipulated the graph. And as someone who loved science and was very dedicated to science, he was shaking. He was visibly shaking at how upset he was to see someone so blatantly distort the science. But to do that for every single book, every single sentence that comes out, it's an incredible amount of effort. But what is important is to discredit the agencies who are doing this, and to show a couple of examples of how they do this. And I was just I thought I might just take the chance that if some of your readers might be thinking, well, given the role of the money making influence that came into the pandemic, there is some distrust of elites, and for good reason. I do understand that there is good reason, and I also am sceptical. I've seen things that
that's right.
I've lost trust with some of these. I think we all have. The whole society has, but. I wish it was untrue, but what makes me certain that it is true is that those 3 years working with the scientists, there is the integrity of these individuals.
If you'd like to hear the rest of this episode and gain access to all of the episodes of The Voices of War, simply become a subscriber using the link in the show notes. As you know, I will not feature any ads on the show, which is made possible solely through the support of our subscribers. If you find value in the content, you can become one now.